Hello, my name is Miss Amber Stokely, and I'm here with your English Live reading selection review today. Now, if you've been following the series, we are on lesson 4 of Unit 1, which is Poetry in the Age of Reason. So there's a couple of things I want to go over before we get into the lesson, just as a reminder for students. This is an overview mostly of the text. There's a couple things that you're going to need to understand about the text and how it works before going into it. So if you've had trouble with the tutorial before you get to the poem that we're about to cover today, which is To His Excellency George Washington by Phillis Wheatley. I believe you can find it on slide 19 of this lesson. You may need a tutor to go over a couple of things with you more in depth, especially when it comes to poetry. Understanding how poetry is structured is a little difficult. And I just want to make sure that everyone has the resources that are available to understand things. I am going to do a short overview, but the overview might not be enough if you are a student that is struggling really hard with understanding the background structure of the poetry and not just the meaning of the poetry. So with that out of the way, I'm going to share my screen and get started. Now we're going to make a couple stops in the tutorial before we get exactly to the reading. So the first stop is here on slide 5. Just as a reminder of what age this is, we're learning about poetry from the 17th century. Just as a reminder, I include this almost every time I mention centuries. If you're not sure what set of years we're talking about in terms of centuries, take the number that they give you. In this case, it would be 17 right here. You're going to subtract 1 and then add double zeros. So the 17th century is the 1600s. Now, on this slide, they go over the background for the Age of Reason. And basically, they talk about how the American Revolution came to happen. They mention King George III and the restrictive rules, laws, regulations on the American colonists. And because they felt like they weren't being valued for what they were giving Britain in exchange, they basically asked to be independent, excuse me, and that led to the American Revolution. Now, the writing at the time, you have to remember, was influenced a lot by the people who wrote in the 17th century, that's the 1600s, and they argued with logically structured arguments. They talk here about using sound, which means like reasonable, logical arguments in their writing. And as a result, writers of this era valued reason, order, and moderation over faith. So in the last lesson, in the colonial literature lesson, we talked about a lot of faith-based writings, specifically because there were a lot of pastors that did sermons and things like that and speeches. This is very different. You also have to remember that the people in the colonies at the time used their texts to try to reason with Britain about being independent and removing some of the control that Britain had over the colonies at the time. So this was an age where everyone was sticking to their guns and trying to create logical arguments that made sense to prove their point instead of relying on too much kind of like religious guilt tripping in a way. Down here it says, while many writers continued to mention God in their literary works, often as a means of persuasion, so to persuade or convince people who were religious, they tended to avoid themes of the afterlife and instead focus on defining and pursuing a better government and society. So instead of threatening people with the consequence of going to hell if they don't help them with the revolution, they tried to argue that the things they were fighting for would make America better, and they felt like that was a better approach than just trying to claim that God was on their side. It's important to remember that if you are religious you do always think that God is on your side. And that includes people who are not doing the best. The monarchy in Britain also believed that God was on their side and that their rules and laws were supported by their faith. So when you're dealing with tons of groups of people who are religious, you have to have a different approach because everyone thinks that they are correct. So they went for, even if, this is, even if you feel the way you feel about your faith, here are other reasons why it's important for us to band together and be, like a nation together and those sort of things. Now, the next place we're going to stop is slides 10 and 11. Now, it's important to stop here, and I did it on my last video as well, just because this is a list of things that you need to make sure that you understand at least a little bit before we get into the reading. So I'm going to go through some of these really quickly. Again, if you're really having trouble with this, there are a couple resources that you could go to. You could talk to your mentor or advocate if they tend to tutor you in things. You can also schedule tutoring and let them know that you need someone to go through these concepts and explain them in depth. I did actually attempt to record a video with explanations of all of these things and everything that you would need, but that is pretty hard, and it basically stopped me from being able to focus on the actual poem. It was almost 3 hours long. So I think it's actually better for you to schedule tutoring. We also have live lesson videos that cover just the tutorial and not so much the reading selection. So you can ask for links to those and try the overall lesson before coming to the reading selection and see if that helps. But of course, the ultimate help will be to have, a tutor scheduled with you to go over these in depth. So really quickly, a couplet is a pair of rhyming lines. That's it. Figurative language is non-literal language that helps readers imagine a description, adding clarity and meaning to the text. And when they say literal here, literal means like the label is what's on the tin. If you say, I'm going to the store, there's no like flowery creativity in that. That is a direct statement about what you are going to do. So that's literal. Figurative is when you use more creative or imaginative language, and it's not just the surface dictionary definition. So if I say, I'm strapping on my boots, packing my bag, and taking a long, overdue, arduous journey to the grocery store. At this point, I'm making the trip to the grocery store seem like I'm going on an adventure. Which is not exactly what it is. At least most people would not consider it that, especially because it's a routine thing that you do all the time. But because you chose like more creative language, you're making it sound more epic. It might be more attention grabbing to people who are listening because they hear the bigger words, the bigger, more complex way that you're discussing it. So that helps with figurative language. And there are other types of basically like word learning, word tricks, literary tricks that you're going to learn in these upcoming English classes. And usually, basically, if you're dressing anything up, it's figurative language. This next one is genre. So genre is a classification of literature characterized by particular content and form. So everyone's familiar with these, whether you know it or not. A genre is a type of thing. Especially when we're talking stories. So books have genres, movies have genres, even video games have genres. Basically, if you can label a game or movie or a book into a category, and you know what to expect when you hear the name of that category, then it is part of a genre. So for a book or a movie, an example of this might be fantasy. There's going to be like magic or other worldly creatures in it, right? For video games, it might be something like an MMO, like so a massively, like played game. Or if you say an FPS, that's a first-person shooter. There are things that you expect in your brain because you know the pattern of what those games are like. or like a platformer, for example, when you're jumping up and down on like platforms or levels. Um, all of these things are genres. If you have an expectation of what will be in the thing that you're about to watch or play or consume, or read, whatever, that would be a genre. So it's just how you categorize different types of things. So for literature, it's just any type of book, play, or other writing. So for example, tragedies, usually in a tragedy, you can expect everyone to die. That's usually the expectation for tragedies. For like a romance story, usually, there's two characters from different backgrounds that come together and maybe don't even like each other at first, but through circumstances develop feelings for each other. So if you had a book that called itself a romance but didn't have any of those things in it, you would be like, hold up, why? And the fact that you would pause when something breaks your expectation means that there's a category that the types of stories fit into. And that's basically what a genre is. Okay, now these last two are the big ones here, that I think are important, for people to know the resources for, especially if you have a hard time with poetry. So I'm going to go through and explain this in the simplest way possible. And this is one of those things where this lesson isn't completely about the structure of the poetry they're expecting you to already know. So I'm going to list you some places where you can go to try to understand this explanation more in depth. But if you're really struggling, even after hearing me talk about it and looking at the resources, that you might just need to hire a tutor to spend, like an hour, or an hour and a half or something like that, to just really break it down and give practice on what it is so you can recognize it. So an IAM is a type of metric unit. So when we're talking metric unit, we're talking like being able to measure something in a line of poetry. So we're talking poetic verse versus, think of like a song, right? So we're talking a group of lines in a poem. So if we're measuring something in a poem, that gives you a hint at what an iamb is already. So it tells you here, it uses these words here, unaccented and accented, but I prefer the ones that are down here in the iambic pentameter. These two are related. Unstressed and stressed syllable. In any other place in Edmentum, basically this is what you see. Unstressed syllable and stressed syllable. So the long story short is, when you break down words, right, they have syllables to them. That is the number of sounds that are in a word. An iamb is a specific measure of sounds in a word or in a group of words. So an iamb is specifically when you have a short sound followed by a long sound. Now, the way that they put this academically and professionally is unstressed for short and stressed for long. So an iamb is when you have a group of two syllables where the first one is short or unstressed and the second one is long or stressed. Now I'm going to give you an example. An example of this pretty much is, you can go to the first word of this slide, before. Before is a word with two syllables, right? If you say it out loud, like actually say it on your tongue, before. I know that it's spelled before, but when you say it out loud, what we say is before. The E gets cut short because that OR sound in the last half of the word kind of stretches out. So before is a good example of an iamb. The B, before, the B and before is a short syllable. And then for actually stretches out. You can hear, if you say before, you can physically hear that the OR stretches on longer than that first part. So you have before, two syllables, right? And because the first one's short and the second one's long, this would count as an iamb in a line of poetry. Now, the thing about iambs and these patterns is that for a pattern to be a pattern, it has to be something that repeats, right? So iambic pentameter here is when you have an iamb, a short syllable followed by a long syllable that repeats 5 times. Now, what does this look like in a poem? We're going to see this in pretty much, if you watch the last video, our last poem was in iambic tetrameter, which means that that pattern repeated 4 times. But this one that we're about to read, to His Excellency George Washington, if you've read it already, and hopefully you have gone through this tutorial before watching this video, that is in iambic pentameter. So if you have a pattern of 2 syllables repeating 5 times, that means that the lines are going to have 10 syllables altogether. So you should be able to break down the sounds of the words in the line and count the syllables. I think that figuring out which syllables are long and short is a little hard. You kind of have to train yourself to do that, especially if you're new to this topic. But I'm going to open up a new tab and give you a couple of the resources that we have for you guys to look at some examples. So I'm going to open up this new tab here, and I'm going to open up the English concept summaries. Now, if you are in MVA, you may have been assigned the resource course for your English class. This document is in there. If you've had a math class before, you've seen the math summaries. This is the English version of that. Basically, what has happened is we've gone through all of the tutorials from English 9A all the way to English 12B. And we've taken some of the information that's from the tutorial and we broke it down into PowerPoints very similar to the math summaries. So the idea is you should be able to come to this document and look for the topic that you need to know more information about. And when you open up your the PowerPoint, it'll give you information directly about that instead of you having to flip all the way through your tutorial to find it. What's good about this spreadsheet is that it has all of the classes that you could ever take in English here. So if, say, you're an 11th grader and you've forgotten something that's in 9th grade here, right? You can come back to these 9th grade tabs. You can look at the topics that are here, and some of that information might help you in your 11th grade class. The most important thing here is just this color key, right? So like these are long lists. It's overwhelming to kind of look and read through every single topic here just to get the name of the topic right. So you can search for the topic. You can hit Control F and do a search. Or you can look at the colors here, the color codes. So anything that's grammar related is focus on language, right? It'll be blue. Literary devices, that's the figurative language that we were talking about, different fancy ways that people describe things and put things in writing. That's in yellow. Today, we're looking for poetry, which is this kind of like pinky coral color. So if we scroll down, we have a whole section about poetry here for 9A. Now, what we're going to be looking for is the things that have to do with meter. These are bolded because students need them a lot. So if you open this up, it'll open up this new tab with the PowerPoint. And I'm going to go straight to what I know that we need. But this basically gives you the direct definition, what is meter, how to find it, different types of groups of syllables. I don't want to go through this whole thing today because this is kind of a lesson in and of itself, and I don't want to confuse anyone. You should be able to go through these slides one at a time and put the things together if you need to go over everything. But what we are specifically looking for, there are 2 slides that we need here. First is this one, which is finding meter, right? So the first part of the word that has meter at the end, meter is just the pattern. Remember, a meter is a unit like a measurement, right? So we're measuring how many times this pattern repeats. So meter just tells us it's part of a pattern. It's this first part of the word that's actually important. The first part of the word here is going to tell you how many times that pattern repeats in a line. So if we skip down to pentameter, which is right here, pentameter means 5. Penta is the prefix that means 5. That's it. Now, there are other slides here that have examples of each one of these on a separate slide. So if we're looking for pentameter, We can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're here, pentameter. So it says here a line with 5 feet. So meters is basically how we're measuring it, but you can also call it feet. Feet is also referring to, so feet is the basically the number of times that it repeats. Meter is pretty much just an overall word for the pattern of anything repeating. So we get an example here. And I mean, they basically, pentameter is a line with 5 feet. So they're both referring to the same thing. So there's examples here, and they break down each of the iambs. So remember, the iambs is when you have an unstressed or short syllable followed by a stressed or a long syllable. So all of these syllables are broken up, these sounds of words are broken up into groups of 2. And every other one is bolded. The long syllables are bolded so you can see which ones stretch on. Now, what's important about having these examples here is that poetry and all of this stuff about meter and feet and pentameters, it's easier to tell when you say it out loud. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. If you break down the words from this first line here, it'll help you actually hear with your ears which syllables are short and which ones are not. Please notice that when you're grouping together these syllables, the iambs, right, this unstressed and then stressed syllable unit, it dissects the words, right? So you don't have to use just words that have 2 syllables. You can basically choose words that have the pattern of just having a short syllable first and then a long syllable second. In combination, you can use these in combination with things. What's most important is that when you break these down into groups of 2 syllables, it follows the pattern. And this is part of what makes poetry difficult, right? You have to be able to keep up with this pattern and choose words that fit this pattern for your poem. Because as soon as you choose something that doesn't fit here, then it's not iambic pentameter anymore. So this is part of what makes poetry really difficult. So just as a summary, before we go back into the slide, an iamb is a measurement of sound where you have an unstressed syllable that's short and then a stressed syllable that's long. Iambic pentameter is when this pattern repeats in a line 5 times. That's basically it. The hard parts are being able to break down words into syllables, which takes practice. You have to sound them out. And then when you're looking at a piece of writing, being able to break the syllables into groups of 2 to figure out if it's fitting that pattern or not. There are other patterns that involve more than 2 syllables and things like that, just so that you know. But what we're focusing on is iambic pentameter, which is just syllables in that group of 2. So we're not getting any more complicated than that. And these other lines are also iambic pentameter. So it's good to be able to look at these in practice, breaking these down. Choral, right, is far more red than her lips red, right? Basically, choral is considered like 1 syllable because of the way that some people say it. What's important to remember here is that syllables sound different. If you have different accents, then your pronunciation of words might be different. So especially when we're talking about old syllables and things old writing and things like that, the way that it's broken down might be a bit different. Let's see. So I'm going to close this. And we're going to close this and go back here. So again, that was a very short explanation. I could fill a whole lesson with just explaining meter and iambs and other things, but I just wanted you to have the gist of this concept because you need to understand the rhythm of the lines because the poem we're about to read is definitely iambic pentameter. Okay, now on slide 11 here, we have a list of more things. However, these are different, shorter concepts. They're not quite as hard to explain as the iamb and iambic pentameter. So here we have imagery, which is descriptive language. So we're describing things that relies on sensory detail. So remember, sensory is referring to your senses: eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and hands for touch. So you're describing things in a way that can help readers imagine the setting, the characters, or details of a story or poem. So, for example, you could say, I walked into my friend's house and it smelled sweet, right? So we all have an idea of what something sweet is and what sweet smells are, but that doesn't help you imagine the exact type of scent that was in the house. If you're reading a story and instead they say, I walked into my friend's house and it smelled like apple pie, right? If you've ever had apple pie in your life, you'll be able to recognize the kind of sweet smell that is. And you can use other like imagery for other things as well. If you're describing like the shape of a building, and maybe the building has like a circular roof, like a dome top. You could describe it as like a sphere on top. You could say the building looks like a sun was set on top. The roof was spherical and smooth and reflected light, things like that. So you're adding extra words to help readers imagine what they should be looking at, what they're hearing, what they're seeing through the eyes of the character. That's basically imagery. Now, here next we have the opposite of figurative language, which we already explained, which is literal language. We kind of had to explain literal language to understand figurative language, so we went over it already. But it's language that expresses the primary meanings of words rather than their implied or metaphorical meanings. So it's just the label is on the tin. You take the words at surface value and only interpret what's literally there. If someone says, I ran to the store, if you interpret that literally, that means they actually ran right to the store. Usually people use the word ran in a figurative way to tell you that they were traveling quickly, right? They weren't physically running. That's a figurative usage because it's not exactly what they did. But if a person is telling you something literally, that means that the words that they used are exactly what happened. Now, this next word here is a metaphor. So a metaphor is a figurative comparison that does not use the words like or as. So basically, if you're comparing anything in your language or saying that one thing or describe that something is like something else, that's a metaphor. The complicated part is that you have to do it without actually using the words like or as. So an example of this could be, there was an ocean ebbing in her eyes, right? So we all know that oceans are bodies of water and they are blue. So if you're saying that someone has an ocean in their eyes, you're describing the type of blue that a person's eyes are. Or if you were to say something like her her hair was thick, dark vines sprouting out of her head, right? So vines are sort of like thick plants. So if you have someone whose hair is thick like a vine and it's growing out of her head, right? So maybe this person has like thick dreads or thick braids. And you're making that comparison so that people know what it looks like. So those are examples of metaphor. For example, sometimes people will say, she is my sunshine, right? They mean that that's the person who lights up their life, that shows them the way that makes them happy. That is a metaphor, especially because a person can't literally be sunshine, right? This next one is meter. We talked about this earlier. Recurring patterns. Recurring is just another way to say repeating. It just means repeating like regularly. So repeating patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem, the beat or rhythm to a poem. So how many times that pattern repeats helps to create the sound that you hear in your ears when you're saying words. Mood is the prevailing or like number one feeling or emotion of a literary work, also called atmosphere. Now, mood basically just has to do with the types of words that you use to describe something. Now, if you say that someone is scared looking into the inky black abyss beneath their stairs leading into the basement, the fact that you use the words black, inky, darkness, abyss, or that you are scared, all of those words set the mood to let the person reading know that it's supposed to be a creepy, scary atmosphere because those are the words you picked. So the words that you pick when you're writing tell the person reading the emotion that the characters are feeling or that they are supposed to feel while they're reading. Personification, this happens a lot in the poem that we are about to read. So it says here that this is figurative language describing something non-human by giving it human traits or abilities. So if you were to, and this is the example I always use in tutorials, if you were to say the trees danced in the wind, right? Trees cannot actually dance. They don't have feet. They're not alive in the same way that we are. So when you say they're dancing in the wind, you mean that the wind is causing their branches to shake, right? So you're giving them a human description, even though they're not human. And that's pretty much what personification is. Then we come down here to rhyme. Rhyme is words that begin with different sounds but end in the same sound. So basically, your lines in a poem rhyme if the ending words specifically rhyme with one another. And that means that the words at the end start with a different sound but end in the same sound. Now, a rhyme scheme, this is another sort of difficult one for students. It is the pattern of rhymes in a poem notated with lowercase letters. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide to sort of explain what this is, so we'll come back to this one. Now, this next one says assonance. So assonance is when you repeat the same vowel sound followed by different consonant sounds within several closely grouped words. So if I were going to say, I was so happy when I found my pen that I got on my knees and pounded the ground, right? So we have found, pound, and ground, right? These are all sounds and words that have the same vowel sound in the middle. As a short refresher, vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. So ground has that O-U-N-D, so does found, and so does pound. So those are vowel sounds that are repeating in a line. So that's assonance. Then we have alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the same beginning sound among closely grouped words. So if you have a group of words that start with the same sound, the same beginning sound, that's alliteration. So an example of this would be a tongue twister. She sells seashells by the seashore. That's alliteration because it's a lot of the same sounds grouped together. Okay, so now we're going to come back to rhyme scheme. And I just want to give you an example of rhyme scheme. Let's see if I can find that poem. Okay, yes. So we'll take this poem and I'll break it down really quickly. And we'll try to figure it out. We'll try to figure out how to explain rhyme scheme. So basically it's when you're marking you're basically marking like which words rhyme with each other. And the point of a rhyme scheme is for you to understand which letters are rhyming with each other, which words are rhyming with each other. And basically we do this by assigning a letter to each of the different sounds that are at the end of the line. Now, this sounds a little confusing, so that's why I wanted to go through this example really quickly. And see, the poetry stuff can become a little complicated if you don't understand the concepts already, which is exactly why if you're really having trouble with this, even after I breeze over it, it's important for you to meet with a tutor. So if we look just at the end lines that are here, right, the end sections, we have a hint, print, stall, all, face, place, degree, plead, indeed, appear, and beer. So if we're gonna mark these to find the rhyme scheme, we're just gonna take these one line at a time. So our first word here is hint, and then we have print. These are the first sounds that we have that rhyme, and these two rhyme with each other. So we're gonna assign this sound, the int sound, I-N-T, a letter. We're gonna assign an A, because it just makes sense to start at the beginning of the alphabet, right? So we're gonna come down and label this second line A as well, because these two have the same sound. They rhyme with each other. Now, the rest of the poem, in terms of noting the rhyme scheme, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the different sounds through the rest of the poem and assigning them letters based on if they rhyme with any other sounds in the poem. So our first sound is A, because we're starting at the beginning of the alphabet. So we come down to stall, right? We're here at stall. The question you should ask yourself is, does stall rhyme with hint or print? If it did, you would assign it A, but it doesn't. Print, hint, and stall are different sounds. So A, the A-L-L sound is different from the I-N-T sound. And I know that that sounds like something that's very obvious, but when you're noting a rhyme scheme, I think sometimes it's difficult for students to grasp it while they're going along. They kind of rush. Now, stall is a different sound than print or hint. It doesn't rhyme with either of those at all. So that means it's a new sound in the poem at the end of the line, and we're going to label it B. So we come down to this next line, which is all. All does rhyme with stall, but it doesn't rhyme with hint or print. So we're going to label it B. Any lines that rhyme with each other in a poem would have the same letter. So the point of the rhyme scheme is for someone to be able to look at this list of letters on the line and know which lines rhyme with each other. So we come down to face and place. Face and place rhyme with each other, but it doesn't rhyme with stall. Neither one of them do. And they don't rhyme with hint or print. So that means we're on a new sound, we're on a new letter. So we have C and C. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, we have a pattern here. And you are absolutely correct. We do have a pattern here. This poem is made up of couplets, and that means that these are groups of two lines that rhyme with each other before moving on to a different sound. Couplets are just two lines that rhyme with each other. Anything else is a different type of like poetry paragraph. So we have a bunch of couplets that have been pushed together to form the paragraph in this part of the poem. So honestly, you can predict how the rest of this is going to go, right? So we come down to degree and T. Degree and T rhyme with one another, but they don't rhyme with place, all, or print. They're not the same as any of these other sounds we have. So this is going to be D and D. That's what we have here. I'm just adjusting this so it looks a little better. So we come down to the next line. We have plead and indeed. Now this might trip up some students because we just did degree and T, but plead and indeed end with a D sound. It's a hard D, you can hear it, plead and indeed. So these are actually not the same sounds that we have above them in degree and T. It's not degreed and teed, it's degree and T. So these next lines, plead and indeed, sound close, but don't actually rhyme with the two lines above it. So these get separate letters as well. We have E and E. Because plead, it's not the same sound as T, it's not the same sound as place, it's not the same sound as all, and it's not the same sound as stall. I'm sorry, as print. So it doesn't match any of these sounds in these other lines. And then we have our last lines, we have appear and beer. These are also very different sounds from anything else that we have here. So this would be F, F. And this is our rhyme scheme for this poem. If we were to write this out the long way, the rhyme scheme would be A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, F, F. And what that tells you is that you have a bunch of couplets stacked on top of each other. So every set of two lines rhyme with each other, but not anything else. If there was a line, say at the end here, that said like sprint, or flint or something like that, right? Say you have a line that did rhyme with one of these other ones, then you would just label that line whichever letter that's been assigned to what it rhymes with. So say the next line for this poem after the beer line was something about striking a flint. If you were to put this into the rhyme scheme, you would just label it A, because flint has the same ending as hint and print. Even though it's from the first line, you would still label it the same letter because it's the same sound. So hopefully that makes sense. This is how you get a rhyme scheme. It's much easier to get a rhyme scheme when you're looking at the lines vertically, like from top to bottom this way. Usually, if you're looking at a rhyme scheme and it's just written out like normal text in a line from left to right, it's because we know for sure what the rhyme scheme is and they're just letting you know. In some of the later English lessons, they will actually tell you, here's the rhyme scheme for this poem. But if you're mapping one out for yourself, I think it's always easier to do it from top to bottom when you have the poem in front. Alrighty, we're gonna clear this and move on to our reading selection finally. So now that we're familiar with those concepts, we're going into His Excellency General Washington. So they give you a little bit of information about Phillis Wheatley on slide 18. Please make sure to read this. It gives you information about her life story and how she came to start writing things, and how things ended for her later on in life. There's also a hint as to information in this poem there. For example, we have the poem also paid tribute to Christopher Columbus, by describing America as a radiant goddess whom she called Columbia. So this is important because she's describing America as a goddess, so as something bigger than just a country. And that's going to help you with answering some of the questions in the lesson activity later on. Speaking of the lesson activity, I do want to actually go over some of these questions before we open up the text. It's important to know what questions you have to answer. Now, if you're going through this text the first time, like if you're going through, the tutorial for the first time, don't worry. They give you the link to this poem. So if you're watching this and you haven't gone through all of the slides yet, which is a terrible idea, you should definitely have gone through this lesson before watching this video, at least once. But if you find yourself in that position, you can still come to this slide where the questions are. Read the questions first so that you know what you are looking for when you go into the poem. I will not be answering these questions in this video. The point of this is to help you understand and interpret the poem. But I will read these questions just to give you an idea of what we're looking for and sort of bring all the information that we've gone over together all together. So the first one says, how does the poet personify the United States? So we know that personification is giving human traits to something that isn't. So we're giving human traits, personifying the US. So you're going to look out for that in the poem. Part B, what natural phenomena does the speaker use to characterize the Continental Army? So first things first, housekeeping. The Continental Army is the army of the colonies. Natural phenomena are basically like natural weather patterns. So things like mudslides, hurricanes, and stuff. So this kind of gives you a hint as to what's in the poem already. They're asking you which type of natural phenomena is used. So you just have to pay attention to what comes up in the poem. Part C is, how do this poem's imagery, meter, and rhyme contribute to the meaning of the poem? So we pretty much know already, and they mention this in the analysis sections if you've seen this tutorial already, that this is written in iambic pentameter. That's why they gave it to you in the beginning and wanted you to be familiar with it. So they're basically saying the imagery, how they describe things, the meter, which is the pattern and how it sounds, and that includes the rhyme too. How do these things contribute to the meaning of the poem? So, what do you think is the importance of having this poem have this rhythmic pattern that repeats in terms of the sound of the poem? Then we have part D. What comparisons, so that means what things that are similar, do the poet use to denote the vast size of the American army? So basically, she's trying to say that the American army is large. What does she compare it to express that in the poem? That's what you're looking for. And then part E, what does the line Britannia droops the pensive head imply? Now, I'm not going to answer this question for you, but I will help you out by interpreting this line even before we get into the poem. Britannia is another way of referring to Britain. Britannia is sometimes what people consider the personification of Britain, especially in colonial times. So we have Columbia and we have Britannia. These would be like the goddesses of these nations. And Britannia is being personified because it's given human action here. Droops means to drop down, right? The pensive head. So pensive means thoughtful or deeply contemplative. You're spending time like thinking about things deeply. So that's that line. Britannia droops the pensive head. So you're going to look for this in the poem while we're going over it. And it wants to know what the implication of this line is. So what, if you read in between the lines, what does this say maybe about Britain or about the revolution? So that is what, these are the things that we're looking out for in the poem. So now that we've done all of this, without further ado, we're going to open the poem itself and get into it. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to read this poem straight through first, and then we'll go into it and mouse over these areas and things like that. So let's get into it. Okay. I'm going to try to highlight as we go along so you guys can keep place. Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, in nations' gains at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows and veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel bind her golden hair. Wherever she signs this native of the skies, unnumbered charms in recent graces rise. Muse, bow propitious. I always have difficulty with that. Bow propitious while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. As for Aeolus, heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and night and a night of storms. Astonished ocean feels the wild uproar. The refluent surges beat the sounding shore. Or thickest leaves in autumn's golden rain. Such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek the work of war, where high unfurl the ensign waves in the air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou know'st them in the fields of fight. Thee, first in peace and honors, we demand the grace and glory of thy martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. 1 century scarce performed its destiny round, when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace this land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of the nation on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising heels of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading, Washington be thine. So now that we've heard the poem in its entirety, we are going to go through the lines and make sure that we understand what they're saying. Now, the way that I normally do this is I am going to mouse over the lines, the lines that are lines and words that are underlined, because sometimes there are questions, um, and sometimes there are definitions. I will also be stopping to look up words that might be difficult for some students. I think that this is an important step, especially because um, some students forget that you guys can open up a tab or look up on your phone words that you're unfamiliar with. It's important to not just sort of gloss over and think you understand something from context clues, because a mastery test will sometimes ask you very specific questions about the lines, or it'll ask you to pick out lines that do certain things. And if you don't know what the words mean, then you won't have any hope to answer these questions correctly. So I am going to stop and look up certain things, especially if it comes to, like words that I think some people might have difficulty with. Um, if it's a pretty simple word that you might not have come across yet, I'll just tell you what it means. Okay. So if you haven't been able to tell, this poem is also written in couplets. So these are pairs of rhymes, lines that rhyme, just like the example that we looked at from slide, I think that was slide 12. So starting from the beginning, celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. So celestial just means of the sky or of heavens, or divinity. Celestial things usually have to do with heavenly things. At first, heavenly used to refer to just the sky on its own, but because of a lot of religions believe that heaven is like somewhere very high in the sky, the word heavenly and celestial not only have to do with the sky, but also at this point have to do with um, but also have to do with religious, holy things, divinity, as they say here. So, enthroned in realms of light. So, if you're enthroning someone, you're basically installing them as a ruler, right? So, we're saying that the heavenly choir that is like settled in or installed in these realms of light. So, they're basically talking about heaven. Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. She's addressing the celestial choir and telling them that she's writing about Columbia's scenes of glorious toils. So toil is a word that means work. When you are toiling away, it means you're working hard, right? So if you're doing if we're talking about a glorious toil, we're talking about a glorious work. Like this is work effort that people are putting in. So she's writing about the work of Columbia or America. And it's the scenes, right? So she's describing how, like in different places, America's working hard with the revolution. So here we have, while freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms. So it says, to whom does the word her refer? We're referring to Columbia. Columbia, they told you in the other slide, is a goddess that's supposed to represent America. So that's who they're referring to here. So while freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms. So we're saying that freedom's cause, obviously, this is the work that they're doing fighting for the revolution. They want America to be free. And it says cause her anxious breast alarms. So obviously, the fact that we're trying to be free, the colonies are trying to be free of Britain, is a cause for alarm. They are not currently free, so they're very anxious and concerned about getting that freedom. So she's just describing the state of America being alarmed at having to fight for their freedom. Basically, they're alert, they're aware that there's a problem and they're trying to deal with it. And she's describing the issues that are happening in the country as though they're happening to this goddess. So it says, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. Now, if you mouse over refulgent, it says radiant, shining in quality or state. So she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. So flashes dreadful is just saying that she basically is feeling dreadful. And that's supposed to be reflecting on how the country feels. So the country doesn't feel good about going to war. but she she, as in the goddess and also the country, are ready to go to war anyway. Refulgent arms is shining in quality or state. I personally think, since this is a goddess, the refulgent arms is talking about how, since she's a goddess, she is in heaven in a bright and shining place. Those would be the arms that are carrying her as a goddess, right? And she feels dreadful while she's up there, because that's where goddesses are. So we're just describing the state of the country through her. We're fighting for freedom. We're not feeling great about war, but it's something that has to be done because our freedom has to be won. So we have see Mother Earth, her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. So we're talking about Mother Earth, and it says see Mother Earth, her offspring's fate bemoan. So Mother Earth is a separate figure that we're referencing here. And supposedly Colombia, which is a country on Earth, would be an offspring or child of Mother Earth, right? So she's writing about, Wheatley is writing about Mother Earth bemoaning her offspring or the fate of America. Now it says bemoan here. I'm gonna go ahead and look that up because I think most students would not know what bemoan means. So we're gonna look up bemoan. Now, bemoan means to express discontent or sorrow over. So bemoan is basically the word that moan comes from. When you bemoan something, you're making that moaning sound. You are expressing unhappiness. So Mother Earth is bemoaning her offspring or Columbia's fate, the fate of America. And when they say the fate of America, they mean the fact that we're being ruled by Britain and that we have to go to war to even get our independence. So when it says, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. This is pretty straightforward, actually. Gaze is to look at something. Scenes before unknown are scenes that have never been seen before. So by nations, they mean other countries. So it says here, what was happening at the time in the American colonies that was new in the world, right? The type of organizing for war against Britain that happened in America, in the specific way that the fighting happened, the fact that we were successful at gaining our independence, writing to them, trying to send representatives to argue for America's freedom and things like that. All of those things happening at the same time, back to back to back, was considered by nations at the time as something that hadn't been done before. Like, obviously, you had uprisings and people that fought back against people who had colonized their land, but it happening the same way that it did in America, with the colonies coming to a consensus and writing their Bill of Rights and their Constitution and everything before going to war. All of those things happening together were considered to be new at the time. So see the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows and veil of night. So these are also pretty straightforward. The bright beams, we're talking about bright lights of heaven's revolving light. So bright beams is basically just another way of referring to the light of heaven coming down to earth. Involved in sorrows and veil of night. So they're describing the fighting that we have to do as night, which is bad. Like, usually the night is referencing things that are not great. If it's nighttime, it's dark, you can't see, it's easy to get lost. So they're describing heaven as supporting them fighting the war by being involved in sorrows. That's the sadness that the Americans are experiencing, being under the British people, I'm sorry, and the veil of night, which is also referring to the situation. Now, if we come down here, we've got the rest of the poem. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair. Olive and laurel bind her golden hair. So if we come over here, Olive and laurel says, what do these classical references symbolize? Now, if you look up olive trees, like if you've ever heard of extending the olive branch, it's an idiom that means to offer peace. It's similar to waving the white flag. And laurel branches are basically things that were worn as headpieces by the Greeks. So I'm actually going to do a search here for laurel. Yes, so this is what a laurel wreath looks like. If you've watched any Greek or Roman based like TV shows, you've probably seen people wearing these. Caesar is often shown as wearing some of these. He's like the most famous of those people. If you've encountered Caesar anywhere, you've probably seen him wearing this, right? So this wreath, this laurel wreath, is supposed to represent victory. So if she's wearing olive and laurel in her hair, that means that she's representing peace and victory. So basically saying we didn't want to fight. We want to just be able to survive as a country on our own and be independent. We're only fighting because we have to, because Britain won't let us go. And then this first line, the goddess comes, we're talking about Columbia. She moves divinely fair. So fair just sort of means in this case, like with grace, gracefully. And she's moving with a divine version of this. Divine just means godly. And then it says, wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charmed in recent graces rise. So native of the skies is basically saying that Columbia, this goddess, is a part of heaven that's come to visit them, to fight for them, or inspire them, because she's the personification of America's dreams. So they're basically saying wherever the spirit of America is, unnumbered charms, so unlimited charms, goodwill, that kind of thing, and recent graces rise. So she's basically saying that this spirit of America, wherever she shows up, is good luck. So now we get into this next stanza here. Muse, and this is underlined. So she's Wheatley is calling upon this muse. And the reason why she's doing this is because in older Greek and Roman poetry, they would call upon the beings that are supposed to inspire them, basically. And it says here, a Greek goddess. In this context, it would be Erodi, who inspires poets. Classical poets often ask muses to help them relate a story. So it's basically them adding a small, tiny prayer at invocation. You're trying to get that inspiration to show up to help you write. So muse, bow, propitious, while my pen relates. And if we mouse over here, propitious, favorably disposed, so being a good omen. So she's saying that she's hoping that this muse shows up to give her good luck while she's writing. And it says, while my pen relates means to tell or show something to someone, to recount something. And then we have in the next line, how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. So her pen is relating how Columbia's armies poured through 1,000 gates. So at this point, she's talking about the war, about how the armies have gone through different gates. And it says here, as when Aeolus, heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms. So if we come over here, Aeolus is a Greek god of the wind, more commonly known as Aeolus. So we have Aeolus, heaven's fair face deformed. So we're talking about more Greek gods. So heaven's fair face is basically just saying, giving him the description of being a god from heaven. So heaven's fair face is just being described, Aeolus is being described as someone heavily who is gorgeous and charming. And then it says deforms. So deforms here is his face is changing from something that's beautiful into something that isn't. And then the next line says, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms. So we're saying that the armies poured through 1,000 gates the same way that Aeolus enwrapped his face in tempests in a night of storms. So they're saying that the armies basically came through the same way that the god of wind would, while transforming into storms that ravage the land overnight. So the armies here are being compared to a night of storms and a tempest. A tempest is a very specific type of like violent wind. So basically we have a whole couplet here, 2 lines that are just dedicated to describing what kind of storm the armies were crashing through 1,000 gates. Astonished ocean feels the wild uproar. The refluent surges beat the sounding shore. So if we come down here, we have refluent, so that means flowing back. So astonished ocean, we're describing the ocean as being astonished or surprised, feels the wild uproar. So she's saying that these winds that are similar to how the armies poured through are enough to surprise, shock, or astonish the ocean, and saying that it's so strong that the ocean can feel the uproar, and that the surges beat the sounding shore. So at this point, we have wind pushing the ocean even to come up on the shore. So this is adding more description to how strong the night of storms and tempests are. And remember that she's comparing the armies to the force of this storm. So that's why it's being described in so much detail. And then it says here, or thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. So we're saying thick, the army is thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain. So if you've ever gone outside and seen all of the golden leaves in the fall falling from trees, it seems like leaves are everywhere, especially if you're in a very tree heavy area. And then it says, such and so many moves the warrior's train. So the warrior's train is basically just the force of the armies coming through. And she's making a second comparison here and saying that there are so many soldiers fighting on the field that it's as clogged as golden leaves during autumn, like in the trees and on the ground. And you can tell that's what she means because she says such and so many. So in bright array, they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in the air. So in bright array, array is like an order. So basically, whatever order the soldiers are in, they seek the work of war. So the work of war is to fight, obviously. If you're seeking something, you're looking for something. So basically, she's describing them as bright, they're hopeful, in the order that they are marching to seek out the work of war, which is to fight. And then it says, where high unfurled, the ensign waves in the air. So the ensign is the flag. If you mouse over it, that's what it is. So as the bright array of soldiers seek the work of war, their flag is unfurled or unfolded, and it's waving in the air. Now, if you scroll up, that's what this picture is supposed to give you a portrayal of here. Yep. So this is Washington crossing the Delaware. This is a painting. So the Delaware is a river that they had to cross over. And this also ties in, and that's why they put this here. The fact that Washington's soldiers had to cross the Delaware River to get to some of the British soldiers is probably why she described the armies as a storm that disturbed the ocean. So they were only crossing a river, but it was still a pretty big river. And the fact that they had to move across it to get to their enemies made her want to compare them to a night of storms pushing on the ocean and beating the shore. So it says, shall I to Washington their praise recite? So we know who Washington is. This is George Washington. And it says here, not the location, just in case you weren't sure. So shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou knowst them in the fields fight. So remember that in the beginning, this poet Wheatley, Phillis Wheatley, was addressing heaven. So if she's addressing the heavenly choir, she is telling them about what the Americans have done, but she's also aware that anyone in heaven is supposed to know what's happening down on earth. So it says here, shall I, their praise recite, should she praise Washington and his, shall I praise the armies, um, should I praise the army's like actions to Washington? But enough thou knowst them in the fields of fight. So we have like kind of a double thing happening here, not only with um, the heavenly choir know what's going on and not really need this description, but if Washington's leading the soldiers, he would also know of what they've done. So she's questioning here, should I go through every little thing that they've done to sing their praises when everyone witnessing the poem would know firsthand of what they did? Thee, first in peace and honors, we demand the grace and glory of thy martial band. So thee is referring to Washington here. First in peace and honors. So basically she's saying, you've done so much for the war that you are like the number one person who deserves praise. So she's basically going into detail about knowing that he knows what the fight is about, right? She starts off by saying, should I tell you about what your soldiers are doing? And then she says, no, you probably know enough. And then in these two lines, thee is basically an older term for you. So she's saying you first in peace and honor. So she's addressing Washington directly. We demand the grace and glory of thy martial band. So she's saying that she is demanding the recognition. Martial just has to do with military and fighting. So the martial band, she's saying she is demanding the recognition, grace, and glory of his group of soldiers. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. So these are more, straightforward lines. If you're famed, that means like famous. For valor, valor is an extreme type of bravery and courage. And then for thy virtues more. So what she's saying here is you're even more famous for your virtues, like your morals, than you are your bravery. And then that second line, hear every tongue, that means every person speaking, thy guardian aid implored. So in that line, she's saying, hear everyone pleading to whoever they believe in, their guardians, um, for your aid, basically. He's considered a guardian because he's the person leading the revolution. He is the person who helped bring success to the revolution. Most people agree that if George Washington wasn't in charge, the American soldiers probably would not have won the revolution. So everyone's, imploring means begging or pleading. So everyone is wanting the guardian aid of Washington. And then it says, 1 century scarce performed its destined round, when Gallic powers or Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. So here, Gaelic is French. So it says here, reference to the colonists' defeat at the French in the French and Indian War. So pretty much, 1 century scarce performed its destined round. What they're saying here is it's been 100 years, roughly, because that's a century, 100 years, from the French and Indian War, when Gaelic powers Columbia's fury found. So Columbia is America. Gaelic is referring to the French. So basically the colonies and their armies were defeated by the French in the French and Indian War. So she's saying it's been 100 years since that happened. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. So pretty much what's being said here is that the colonies were defeated by the French and they found the Columbia's fury. Uh, because obviously, if you get beat in a war, you're probably mad about it. So she's saying that since the colonists were upset at being defeated by the French a century before, other people who are disgracing America's freedom will also find America's fury. So she's basically saying the type of fury that America and the colonists felt when they were defeated during the French and India War, they're going to turn that on anyone who dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. So she's saying a few things here. First of all, the easiest thing is she's saying, you're going to bring down Columbia's fury if you disgrace our freedom, right? Our land of freedom. But by saying heaven defended race, she's also asserting that America has the support of heaven in seeking out its independence. So heaven defended is basically saying, like, we're fighting for the right thing in terms of our freedom, and our fury is not going to be something that you want to invoke. You don't want to have beef with us, is basically what she's saying. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. So nations, again, referring to other countries, fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales. So scales, you weigh things on the scales, right? So other nations are watching the outcome of the American Revolution. And then it says, for in their hopes, Columbia's arm prevails. So a lot of countries were hoping in some way or another, at least a few of them, that America will win the Revolutionary War. Partially because Britain poured a lot of resources into the war. And having the colonists win and beat back the British will put the British in a position to sort of not compete as much as they normally would with the other countries for land. And also, if they were focused on the Revolutionary War, then the British would be a little too busy and also may not have enough money, because war costs money, to pursue campaigns against other nations later. If Britain won the Revolutionary War, then it would basically tighten their holds on the country of America and sort of show everyone, like, hey, we're the big boss now. And they might be overconfident in overreaching and confronting other nations. So a lot of countries were kind of waiting to see what would happen with the American Revolution to see what their next move would be. So we have anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. So anon Britannia droops the pensive head. So like anon, I feel like online usually means anonymous. So I think this is one of those words that you should definitely look up if you're not sure. Yeah, especially because it's an old time word that doesn't get much use anymore. So just looking this up, and remember, if this is a word that you come across on the test and you still don't know, look it up again. That's how we remember things. So anon means soon or shortly, very simple. So soon, basically, Britannia, so that's Great Britain, referring to it as kind of like a goddess, like divine name, the same way that Columbia is America in this poem. So soon Britannia is basically what they're saying, droops. Remember, we talked about dropping your head down, the pensive head. So in serious or deep thought, contemplative, considering, right? While round increase the rising hills of dead. So this line is pretty much saying that Britannia has to consider whether or not this war is worth it. So like thinking deeply droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. So America and the colonists are fighting for freedom. Is it worth losing the amount of soldiers just to keep the colonies? Is pretty much what Britain has to consider. And what Phillis Wheatley is saying here is that Britannia is going to have to consider what they're going to do, one, if they lose, but two, even if they win, is it worth losing all the soldiers and the money and the resources of everything? And that ties into the eyes of the other nations that are on the scales, because everyone is looking at what the outcome is of what's happening. Remember that the colonists are a whole ocean away from Britain. So it's not just like, oh, the people who are currently in America are fighting. Britain has to send soldiers over from Britain over on boats to also fight, or call soldiers up from other areas where they were exploring or documenting things. So it costs a lot of money to get people across an ocean to another country, especially at this time, because ships and travel didn't have the same technology that we have now. A lot of people would die on the boats just getting here. If you get lost or turned around, or if there's extra time added to the journey and you don't have enough food, sometimes people are sick. They get scurvy because they don't have enough nutrition. All of these things. So then these next lines, cruel blindness to Columbia State, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. So this is also straightforward. Cruel blindness to Columbia State. So basically, they're saying that Britain is being blind to America being perfectly okay with being the way they are. Like, just, if you can see that our state is to be happy as the colonies, then just let us go. And then it says, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. So she's basically saying that she thinks that Britain is going to regret going to war with the colonists, the Americans. But by the time that they feel bad about it, it's going to be too late. Those soldiers are gone. You can't get them back. Those resources are gone. You can't get them back. Time is passing that they've invested in this war. They can't get that back. So now we're in this last stanza here. Proceed, great chief. So great chief is her referring to Washington, since he's in charge of the army. With virtue on thy side. So by virtue, it means moral standing and good character. Thy every action let the goddess guide. So let the spirit of America guide your every action. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading Washington be thine. So she's saying that Washington deserves all these things: a crown, a mansion, a throne that shines. He's the head of America. A throne that shines with gold unfading. So that is it. That is the entirety of the poem. It is literally her writing a tribute to what the army is doing and what Washington is doing. Okay, so now that we've done this, you would flip over to slide 20 and answer those questions. Now, I am going to skip over to the slides where they do the analysis, and then I'll go over the analysis really quickly, and then we'll wrap up the lesson. Please remember that when you're going through the lesson activities, the goal is for you to try to answer the questions to the best of your ability. We're not graded on the lesson activities. So while you're going through the lesson activities, try not to freak out. Just actually answer them to the best of your abilities and then move on. So I will meet you over on slide 21. Feel free to pause this video while you're going through the lesson activity, and then meet me back here when you're ready. Okay, so assuming you finished the lesson activity, if you haven't and you're having a really difficult time with it, I'm going to assume that you've booked a tutoring session to have someone go over the questions with you a little more. But hopefully you were able to complete it. And then there's an analysis here on slides 21 and 22. So we're in the home stretch of this lesson. Most of this we've kind of gone over already. So we're just going to read over this really quickly. In To His Excellency General Washington, Wheatley praises America by personifying it as a goddess called Columbia. She uses specific imagery to illustrate Columbia as a striking vision and powerful force. The speaker describes Columbia as divinely fair. So fair is like beautiful, with golden hair. So she's beautiful in a way that only goddesses can be, and she has golden hair. She shines in the skies with flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. So by using personification, Wheatley creates a metaphor that compares the new nation to a powerful deity. So flashes dreadful, basically, yeah. So in the previous lines, we were talking about how the nation didn't want to be at war. But Columbia is a powerful deity. So she's flashing in a way where she doesn't feel good about war, but she's pretty powerful being a goddess, right? Like goddesses are usually powerful. Um, and then it says that the speaker goes on to make another comparison about the American military later in the poem. And we read through this section before. This is where she was comparing them to like the god of wind, the night of storms, and beating on the shore, all of those things. And then the second metaphor to uh, thick leaves in autumn's golden rain on the warrior's train. So on slide 22 here, they go into detail about that. The speaker also compares General Washington's army to a tempest that creates great turbulence on the battlefield. The use of this metaphor establishes the dominance of the American forces in the war. So, like, she's comparing them to powerful things, storms, tempests, right? Turbulence means that you're shaking things up on the battlefield. So, remember, they were describing the army as like a wind that shakes up and surprises even the ocean, right? So, that's exactly what we're talking about. That's turbulence. So that establishes the dominance of the American forces in the war and enhances the idea that divine powers guide the American army because they're being compared to a god of wind, right? Then the poem transitions to addressing General Washington himself, and Wheatley depicts him in an elevated manner. So, what they mean by an elevated manner is that she talks about him as if he's divine himself. He has like very important very larger than life importance. Um, and then with details like a crown, a mansion, and a throne, the speaker envisions Washington in an exalted position within the new U.S. government. She employs heroic couplets and repeated imagery to elevate the vision of the United States as a majestic and triumphant nation. And I feel like that's just about it actually for this. So that is to His Excellency George Washington. You might need to go over the poem again, maybe rewind the video to go through the description more than once just to make sure that everything that you understand all of the things that were there. I would just try to take notes on the lines that are most difficult for you to understand or for you to remember. Remember that your notes are not just about what you know it can process. It's about what you'll be able to process when you take the mastery test and when you take the post test, because the post tests are themed on these tutorials. Some of these questions about this lesson might even come up in the final. So the notes are about helping you remember things long term, not just what you can remember to pass the mastery test. So if you think that you might not be able to remember these things later, then I would definitely for sure take notes on some of the meanings and interpretations that you've seen in this video. And that's about it for this selection. I'm going to stop sharing. So again, just as a reminder, these videos are just to help you with the reading selections if you need help with the reading selections and nothing else. If you're having trouble with some of the other aspects of the tutorial, I do want to remind you we have videos going over the entire tutorial without the reading selections. So there are videos and resources out there to help you guys with whatever it is that you need. If it's just the tutorial, we have sources for that. If it's just the reading selection, we're building sources for that. And also we have the concept summaries if you just need small pieces of what's in the tutorial and not the whole thing. If you're having a rough time, against all odds, you still don't seem to get it, don't worry, just book a session with a tutor and we'll go over it with you in more detail. Okay? All right. This is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.